Hey everyone, it's Nikki, and I've been perusing the furry community on YouTube just to see what kind of content was out there. And I've noticed that there's a lot of content focused specifically on the fandom itself, and not a ton of content centered around the media that furries actually consume. Now, a lot of furries consume kind of artist-made or independently made content of their own characters or characters of their friends or artists they admire, but there's also the aspect of the furry fandom that comes from more traditional media such as the film industry, television, video games, and even literature. And so I thought it would be fun to make a series that was dedicated to analyzing media that features anthropomorphic animals from more mainstream, larger corporations as opposed to the more independently created comics and media created by people within the furry fandom. So for the first episode of this series, I wanted to talk about the anime adaptation of Beastars. Beastars is based on a manga created by Paru Itakaki and is made by Studio Orange. The episodes were directed by Shinichi Masumi, and they are written by Nanami Higuchi. It's a 3D animated series, and it premiered in Japan on October 8th, 2019. The story follows Legoshi, who is a gray wolf attending a high school called Sheraton Academy in a world filled entirely with anthropomorphic animals. Recently, a classmate of his in the drama club was mysteriously murdered and eaten by another student. So the story revolves both around the murder mystery of what happened to Tem, the alpaca who was killed, and also centers around Legoshi coming to terms with his identity as a carnivore, as a predatory animal, who has romantic and possibly sexual feelings for Haru, a dwarf rabbit. That is just a very bare bones synopsis. There is a ton that happens in this show, and there's a ton of other characters. Most importantly, Louis, who is a red deer, who is the head of the drama club, and Juno, who is another gray wolf who has a crush on Legoshi. But we'll get into that when we start talking about some of the storytelling. So before I got into some of the technical elements of the show, I wanted to just start off by talking about some of my favorite parts of the show. The first thing I wanted to mention was that I just love everything to do with Golhin. I don't know what it is about him. He's this hardcore vegetarian panda therapist man, and I don't know, just every scene of him was hilarious. I love the bin full of porno mags. He's just funny. I don't know, I like him. He's not my favorite character though. My favorite character would have to be Jack, who I love the tidbit when Jack teases Legoshi for having a crush on somebody, only to find out that he is actually correct. And just everything to do with Jack. And I hear that stuff happens with Jack in the manga, so that should be an interesting character to watch. By the way, I have not read the manga, but I do intend on doing so. Another part I really liked was the scene where Haru and Legoshi eat lunch together. It was really interesting and just tense seeing how Haru reacts to being near Legoshi while he's eating and kind of like baring his fangs. It was something that I had never really considered, like with their interspecies relationship being kind of a barrier, like being frightened for your life while your significant other is just eating. I just thought that was a really interesting scene. And a really interesting take on the kind of dynamic between a predator and prey animal trying to make a relationship friendly or otherwise work. Then there's just Juno. I'll talk more about certain things I don't like about Juno later, but Juno constantly getting friend-zoned by Legoshi was probably one of the funniest recurring gags in the show. It's not really a recurring gag, but he does not like her. I mean, he doesn't hate her, but he just doesn't like her romantically, and he's just completely oblivious to her trying to hit on him, and just, it's so funny to watch her just try and fail, and I don't know, it was a good source of humor for me. On a less comedic note, I really liked the tidbit about the mayor, who is a lion, getting plastic surgery to make his face more kind and gentle looking and thus appealing to his herbivore citizens. I just thought that was a really interesting kind of piece of world building and lore, that would even be something that people in this world would think of doing, especially like the mayor of the city who is a carnivore. And finally, a technical element of the show that I really enjoyed was the usage of different art styles throughout the show. Now, obviously, the main art style is this CGI 3D animation, but there are a couple other styles used throughout the show. For instance, there's the opening credits, which are awesome. That song is great. That's another thing I really like. But the opening credits use some stop motion animation, which looks really nice. There are a couple of comedic moments in the show where the animation shifts to this kind of toony 2D style, particularly some scenes of Legoshi's like kind of inner thoughts as he's mentally on a treadmill that turns into stairs, for instance. There's a flashback that Louis has to his childhood that is rendered in this really kind of gritty, almost like charcoal or pastel looking art style, which I thought looked really cool. And then there's finally a scene towards the end of the first season where Haru is kind of in her own mind, just mulling over her life, and it turns to this really beautiful watercolor style animation. So I just really wanted to kind of put a spotlight on the variations of artistic styles and animation styles throughout the show. I just thought they were a really nice touch. All right, now I'm going to focus on some of the more technical elements of the show, which include the storytelling and writing, the character design and art style, the setting and world building, and the performances. Storytelling and writing. So the storytelling for the length and of the show and the number of episodes, obviously the manga is a lot longer, but just for the number of episodes, it's kind of off the chain. It is like very melodramatic and it escalates very quickly, but it never feels really like overwhelming or too fast. And even though the writing is a bit melodramatic and the scenarios kind of presented in the show are over the top, they don't really feel super unrealistic. You still feel like the characters are real people. As for the pacing of the show more generally, there aren't really any filler episodes. There's only one episode that I think people could construe as a filler episode. I would say it's more of a breather episode rather than filler because it's just kind of letting all of the drama die down and calm down. But that's episode 7, which focuses on a chicken character and how she works for the school producing eggs. And I would argue that even though it is kind of filler in the sense that it's not like the main plot of the story, this episode actually adds a lot of interesting world building to the universe, art style, and character design. I thought the art style of the show was overall pretty good. I'll admit one reason why I hadn't actually got around to reading the Beastars manga was because I didn't initially like the art style. I do like it now, it has grown on me, but I wasn't really into that kind of scratchy, sketchy art style. So when I saw the anime, I was like, oh, this looks cool. I'll watch that instead of reading it. And I do think that the art style of the anime is overall pretty good. I think that the decision to go with 3D animation rather than 2D was really smart. I was watching some video that was kind of talking about the benefits of 3D animation for Beastars as opposed to 2D. And so I'll link that in the description because I thought it was a really interesting take. And I just think that the frame rate of 2D, particularly the frame rate of anime done in 2D, wouldn't have allowed for some of the more subtle movements of a lot of the characters, like tails or ears moving, that really, with animal characters, show a lot of emotion. So I just thought that the art style in that regard was really good. As for the character designs, I really like the Cherryton uniforms, at least the girls' uniforms. The guys' uniforms are kind of meh, whatever, but those like long skirted sailor uniforms in white, I think they're beautiful. I love them. I don't know what it is about them. They're like reminiscent enough of the kind of typical seifuku to be like, oh yeah, these are high schoolers in Japan, but it's not like the stereotypical design of the uniform, so it stands out a little bit. I was a little bit confused by the decision to give some characters kind of the typical anime eyes, which are very much humanoid and like big, and then they've got the iris, in conjunction with giving other characters like Haru or the little fennec fox boy that lives in Legoshi's room kind of bead eyes. It's not too distracting, but especially when some animals are the same species, like when Haru is being bullied by the other rabbit girl. The other rabbit girl has the big anime eyes, but Haru has the dot eyes. It's just a little weird looking, but it's nothing that like draws too much attention that you're like, wait, what is happening? I will say that Juno, I'm sorry, I hate how Juno looks. She does not look like a wolf. She looks like a little frou-frou show dog of some kind. I'm not sure exactly what breed, but just her ears, her snout, she just doesn't look like a wolf. And like characters in universe are like, oh, she's a pretty gray wolf. I'm like, maybe she'd be pretty if she was another type of animal, but as a wolf, no, she's just weird looking. So I really dislike Juno's character design, mostly her ears, to be honest. But I don't dislike her as a character. I just think that her design is not good. But other than her, I don't really have a problem with any of the character designs. Setting and world building. I love most of the world building that takes place throughout this show. Like I was talking about with the little chicken egg girl, I think that was an interesting bit of world building and just showing how carnivores kind of cope or don't cope with their inability to consume meat, with like the kind of veggie patties that they have at school and then the black market that they stumbled across in a later episode. I just thought all of that was really interesting, kind of world building to consider. I do wish that the world building addressed size discrepancies more, because there are animals of a lot of different sizes. They show how classrooms have like different sized doors and stuff, and they show the cafeteria has different tables for animals of different sizes, but not to compare it to Zootopia, and we'll get back to that. But Zootopia, for instance, shows how all these different animals cope with being of different sizes, like the little lemmings in the beginning. They go through those little hamster tubes, and then there's stuff to give the giraffe like a smoothie that's like a little tube. And I wish that this show had kind of gone in that direction a little bit more, because it seems like while there is some attempt to make certain animals bigger and certain animals smaller, they're mostly around human-sized, even if the animals in question would be different sizes in real life. For instance, Bill as a tiger would be way larger than Legoshi, but Legoshi is actually taller than him. So just because there are some height differences, they're not really necessarily accurate to the actual animals. So I wish they'd kind of address that more. Cinematography and editing. The cinematography and editing of the show were mostly good, and I wouldn't really even bring this up if it weren't for the series' use of split screen. Now, I know that split screen, I'm thinking of Pokemon, but it's been used in other anime, and it kind of, in theory, has the effect of mimicking how like comic panels like split up a page. However, this show just used it way too much. There was just no reason. Like, if two characters are like 2 feet apart and looking at each other, you do not need to have a split screen between the two of them to like show a close-up of their face. It's like, if you could either just have them both in frame or do shot reverse shot, you don't need to use split screen. Carrie came out in 1976. We don't need to do this anymore. Like, come on. So that kind of drove me crazy. But other than that, it was competent. Performances. I really like the voice acting in this series, at least for the Japanese dub. I have not seen the English version of the show. It gave the melodrama that I was talking about in the writing earlier a sense of reality. Like, even though the characters might be saying ridiculous things, I'm mostly thinking of Louis, to be honest. They say, like, even though it's so dramatic, just the level of the voice acting in the show makes it come across as believable, just due to the veracity of the performances of the actors. And I also thought all the actors were really well cast. I really like Legoshi, Haru, and Louis' voices. They fit the characters really well. And yeah, the characters, I think they were all cast, and they all did a pretty good job at conveying the kind of ludicrous script that they were at sometimes given, but I really enjoyed the acting in the show, and I think it's one of its strongest features. So before I wrap this review up, I just wanted to kind of think about maybe comparing it to certain other media. So the piece of media that comes to mind for everybody it's always compared to is Zootopia. A lot of people try to say that, oh, Beastars is like edgy Zootopia or realistic Zootopia, which I can see why they're both set in these completely anthropomorphic animal-based worlds where there is this tension between predators and prey, or herbivores and carnivores. However, I feel like thematically the shows are really different. Zootopia is basically an allegory for prejudice and bigotry, and it shows how like prejudice against certain groups of people kind of fester. Beastars, on the other hand, while that is kind of the like setting of the show, like with starting off with Thames murder, kind of highlighting this animosity between the herbivores and carnivores, I feel like it's really more about the personal lives of the characters, particularly Legoshi. But it's just way more about other things. Like, it talks about sex and relationships. It talks about kind of family. And I just think thematically, Beastars is a lot different than Zootopia in terms of, despite the fact that they have a kind of similar setting. Some other media that I can think of to compare to Zootopia would be Kung Fu Panda, just because once again, it's an all animal setting, although Kung Fu Panda is not really concerned with prejudice. I mean, there's a little bit of concern about that topic because Po is kind of laughed at and discriminated against for being a panda when he turns out to be very competent at martial arts, and it's just that they had to cater to his strengths rather than what you would think the typical strengths of a martial artist would be. So I guess they're similar in that regard, that there's species stereotyping and discrimination in both series. My final thoughts on the show are that it's a really interesting insight into certain topics that I don't often see depicted in anime, at least from a female perspective, like gender and sexuality, and just other aspects of growth and relationships. The show is very much a Bildungsroman centered around Legoshi, but also focusing on other characters' lives and how they're growing up. And I just think it's really interesting, and I'm looking forward to season 2 and also starting to read the manga. So I hope you like this video. I plan on making a lot more episodes on media surrounding anthropomorphic animals, so stay tuned for that. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!